Now those wet on wet washes have started to dry now, so you can start to see the really interesting effects you can achieve. And that's just using the blue. But they're almost like mini pictures in themselves, aren't they? Which I find quite exciting. So what I want to do now is just explore you putting some of these techniques to use. So for instance, with the flat washes, you can create some fairly abstract type designs. So you're practicing, but also having a bit of fun using the medium. So if we divide, say, this area here up into a series of squares, you could make a flat square here of that tone, and then maybe add a bit more water to your paint. And have a lighter square at the bottom. But what you need to do is leave a tiny gap between the two squares, otherwise they will run into each other. So you see just a tiny gap there. And then with this section, maybe make it a little bit darker again. But again, leave a tiny gap so they don't run into each other. And then for the last one, maybe get a really strong piece of paint working, so almost undiluted pigment. So that's really quite strong there. The other thing you might try is creating almost a free-form shape. And then put in another shape inside it. But again, just leave a tiny gap so you can create these hard edges. Oh, there you are, I see it's bled into the other side there. I didn't leave enough gap, but you can start to see how the paint runs into each other. But yeah, just leave a tiny gap there. So that's a flat wash, and various ways you might use them. Maybe do a mixture now. So we do a flat wash around the edge, almost like a frame. And then we'll do a bit of wet on wet in the middle. So we've got blue around here, and just need to squeeze out some red. Work up the red a little bit. And pop that in the middle. Starts to look like a bit like a target, doesn't it? But can you see how it's starting to bleed into the blue on the outer edges? And then you might do something similar with the red. Frame that. And then this time introduce the blue. But then you might have some part where it sort of blends into the red around the outside. But as you can see, there's loads of ways of playing with the paint, and personally, I would spend a good hour practicing the flat washes, doing lots of them, so you really become familiar with them. And then the same with the wet on wet. I mean, they're not quite so complicated. You could probably get those working fairly quickly. But then maybe do a whole series of squares with lots of different of these abstract patterns. Try not to make them too representational, because very often that can start to look a bit odd. But just concentrate on almost abstract forms and patterns and see what you can achieve with them. Right, I've now drawn 6 more boxes onto another piece of watercolour paper and mixed up some more paint. And I want to show you some what I call resist techniques, which you can try, and when we come to do paintings, you can incorporate these techniques amongst the flat washes and the wet on wet and so forth. So the first one you might want to try is to just simply bruise the paper with the back of a brush or the back of a pencil, and just push into the surface quite hard, and then by putting some paint down, you should see those lines that you've made with the blunt instrument come through. There, you can see that. Okay, you can get a similar effect, but perhaps with a little bit more expression, using household wax. So I've got a sort of night light here, so just put that on, and again lay the paint over the top, and those marks are revealed. The snag, of course, is that you can't really see what you've drawn because it's almost like invisible writing. But you could always use a coloured wax, but then of course that gives a slightly different effect. Okay, the next one, I'm just quickly putting down a wash to fill the square, trying to keep it as flat as possible. So it's quite a wet wash, and then I'm getting some regular salt, again from the kitchen, and sprinkling that on the top. And what happens is that the salt will, when it's dry, start to absorb, or as it dries, it starts to absorb the paint. So you're left with lots of sort of little white marks on the surface, which is quite a nice texture. But it does take quite a while to dry, so I'll leave that for a moment. Okay, next one. Try doing this. If you push back your brush, you can get quite an interesting spatter technique working. Sometimes it works better if you've got a really stiff brush, so something like an old toothbrush could be quite useful. But of course the snag is you can't really control how far the spray goes, so it's not staying exactly within the box itself. But you can also throw the paint down as well, so it can be quite a useful technique when you're painting something that has an area where there's not a lot of interest, but you sort of just spatter or throw the paint at the surface a little bit. Next one, if you just get a piece of paper, maybe with an uneven edge, you can use that as almost like a stencil to keep the paint up to a sharp edge. You need to keep the paint fairly dry so it doesn't go underneath too much, but you can see it gives you quite a nice result. And if I quickly mix up some more paint, quite dry. The other thing you can do is use the edge of the paper to give you marks as well, and then maybe finish with another stencil effect here. So. Okay, and finally you can take out paint. either with your fingers or with something a bit more absorbent like some kitchen towel. When you press on it or just lightly lay it on the surface, and you'll get different finishes. Or, and this is quite useful if you've made what you consider to be a mistake, you just put the towel on the surface, and providing you do it fairly quickly, you can actually get the paint off almost, but leave a slight residue. And I mean, that's quite useful to know, because I think a lot of people seem to think that watercolour painting is very difficult, and perhaps is compared to some other painting mediums, but there you go, you can actually save the day by having a piece of tissue or paper towel to hand. Okay, so I hope you find those techniques useful. The flat washes will take a bit of practice, so you'll probably need to do maybe a dozen or more before you get the hang of it. Don't be shy of making or mixing up quite a lot of paint. If it's too dry, it will not work. And what you want to do ideally is aim for the paint to be quite shiny and wet when it's laying on the surface, and for the wash to be quite luminous, so you almost get the surface of the watercolour paper coming through the paint. And then of course you've got the wet on wet, which is probably a little bit easier to handle. You're just dropping the paint in with the edge of the brush, or you might want to use it a little bit more expressive. And then you've got the resist techniques, which probably won't take as much practice, but are a little bit more fun, and you can in time combine those with the washes that I showed you earlier. Okay, well, I hope that's been a useful exercise. I don't think there's any need to send you a brief, it's all there in the video, but do send me examples of your work. I'd love to be able to comment. Okay, thank you, bye.